All right, getting back to some college football schedules. I do this every year around this time of the year. We take a look at a lot of the top team schedules for the upcoming season. These aren't prediction videos. I put out prediction videos starting usually the end of May, beginning of June. But this is part of what goes into making your prediction, especially in today's college football of expanded conferences, no divisions. Pac-12 is gone. So the schedules are vastly different, not just from conference to conference, but even within the same conference, you can have sort of a couple of teams that maybe get a fairly easy draw, relatively speaking, compared to a couple of other teams in the same conference that maybe have like a murderer's row type schedule. So it's not as easy when it comes to making predictions to just go, well, I think these are the two best teams in whatever league, so I think they're making that league's championship game. The schedule has a lot to do with that. So I like to spend some time this part of the year before I get to the prediction video, sort of familiarizing myself with as many of these teams' schedules as I can. And I've done a whole series of these over the last few weeks. There's a playlist. Feel free to click back and check them out. Your team may be on there, or a team that you're interested in may be on there. But up today, we're going to talk about the Oregon Ducks. The Oregon Ducks, the best football program over the last 25 years that hasn't won a natty during that period. This conversation kind of comes up all the time. Who's the best team with no natties, or who's the best team, over the last 25 years, or the best team this century that hasn't sort of gone all the way yet? And Oregon, and to a lesser degree Wisconsin, although they've tailed off some recently, are the two teams that tend to come up the most. I believe it's Boise State, Oregon, and Wisconsin are the three teams to have the most wins this century without a national title. And Boise State, obviously, a group of five team. Now, they've had opportunities, or have had an opportunity this past season in the playoffs, but not really the same as Wisconsin and Oregon. So Oregon's been a really good team most years. Over the last 20 or 25 years, they have come up short a couple of times in seasons where you felt like maybe they had what it took to get it done. But I'll ask you this when it comes to Oregon. If you had to bet $1 that Oregon will win a national title sometime in the next 5 seasons, would you bet yes they will, or no they won't? I'd probably bet yes they will. They're in a spot right now, recruiting wise, coaching wise, talent wise, all that kind of thing. It's hard to imagine right now a season where they don't make the playoffs. And if you're making the playoffs every single year, it seems like eventually you might get the job done. They're one of the most talented teams in the country. Dan Lanning's done a great job there through both high school recruiting and transfer portal acquisitions. They've got a great coaching staff. And they proved that they were ready for the Big Ten, which was a question heading into last season, coming from the Pac-12 into the Big Ten. Not only were they ready for the Big Ten, not only were they competitive within the Big Ten, they went undefeated in the Big Ten and won the Big 12 championship game. That, of course, was not the problem. Oregon was the only team in the country last year to go 12-0. That wasn't the issue. They were then 13-0 after they won the Big Ten championship game. That also was not the issue. The issue was they were then 13-1. They just got absolutely destroyed by Ohio State. Now, they had beaten Ohio State earlier in the season at home, Oregon had, and then had them in a rematch out in the Rose Bowl in the second round of the playoffs. Oregon had a bye in the first round. Ohio State hosted and destroyed Tennessee. Then you had the Rose Bowl matchup, Oregon and Ohio State. And let's face it, Ohio State was a different season in the postseason, really, than they were when Oregon had faced them earlier in the year during the regular season. After Ohio State's loss to Michigan, they flipped a switch. They put their Crocs in sport mode, and it was over at that point. They pretty much road graded everybody they played in the playoffs after that, and Ohio State won the national championship. So while it's not an embarrassing loss to lose to Ohio State, they were really, really good. As an Oregon fan, you have to look back on last year and go, well, there's another year where we potentially had what we needed to win it all, and we didn't do it for, whatever one reason or another. But it does seem like, it doesn't seem like they're falling off the map anytime soon. I like what Dan Lanning's got going on there at Oregon. He's a young coach. I like his energy. Let's take a look at their schedule and see what type of a season they might be able to put together in 2025. Now, they start off with a non-con matchup against a lower classification team, Montana State. So, again, this isn't a prediction video, but, Oregon will be a massive favorite there. Then they have another non-con game also at home. This one is against a Power 4 opponent, Oklahoma State. Then a conference game at Northwestern, and another non-con game at home against Oregon State. before going on the road to play Penn State. So that's sort of the first kind of 30% of the season right there, heading into the first bye week. Let's kind of break that down. We've got 3 non-con games. One of them is as close to a guaranteed win, really, as you can get in all of college football, that Montana State game. One of them could be particularly interesting. Oklahoma State, another Power 4 opponent, but had a very disappointing season last year. But they're very well coached with a guy that's been around a long time in Gundy. And the reality is you never really know what type of product Oklahoma State's going to put on the field. Sometimes they have no expectations at all, and they win 10 games and compete for a conference title. Sometimes, like last year, they've got all the expectations in the world, and they just come out flat and never live up to the hype. So we'll see. And then they've got the game at home against Oregon State. Kudos to Oregon and Oregon State for still playing this game. A lot of turmoil in college football over the last few years with the Pac-12 going away, other conferences expanding, teams moving from one conference to another. And while Oregon made the move to the Big Ten, their in-state rival, Oregon State, along with Washington State, by the way, sort of got left in the cold through no real fault of their own. The Big Ten didn't pick them up. The other Pac-12 teams who sort of migrated to the Big 12, the Big 12, for whatever reason, chose not to take Oregon State and Washington State. But at least Oregon and Oregon State are grown up enough, adult enough, and fan-oriented enough to keep that game alive. I'm talking to you, Oklahoma State and Oklahoma. Oh, a similar thing happened with Oklahoma and Oklahoma State, and I'm only bringing this up because Oregon's got both Oregon State and Oklahoma State on the schedule this year. So we have one example of a couple of teams that handled it the right way by coming to an agreement to continue to give the fans what the fans want, which is rare in today's college football, where no one seems to care about the fan. They only care about the almighty dollar or wins or whatever it is. Oregon State was extremely pissed off, extremely angry that they got left out, that Oregon went to the Big Ten and that they were stuck sort of with no conference at all. But they weren't mad to the point where they gave these to one of the fans and said, well, we're just not going to play you. That's what Oklahoma State did. When Oklahoma made the decision to leave the Big 12 and join the SEC, that was it. Now we no longer get to see Oklahoma versus Oklahoma State every year. And I'm going to move on here because I don't want to turn this whole video into a crying session about that. But it's absolutely ridiculous that the administrators at both Oklahoma and Oklahoma State are so childish, so petty, so immature that they can't get together to deliver what for each of their fan bases is the biggest, most important game of the year. Because somebody did something I didn't like and I got my feelings hurt or whatever it is. Put the Bedlam game back on the fucking sports calendar. Oklahoma State. Okay, let's move on. Conference schedule-wise here. At Northwestern and at Penn State. So the first 2 conference games of the season for Oregon this coming year, both on the road. One of them I would consider to be extremely winnable, the Northwestern game. The other one at Penn State, this is going to be an interesting game. This is a long way for Oregon to travel, all the way on the West Coast, all the way over to Pennsylvania. And it feels like this is a game that Penn State absolutely has to win. It just feels that way. Penn State was a good team last year. The reality is Penn State's been a pretty good team most years under James Franklin. But this shadow that hangs over his head in the Penn State football program, that it doesn't matter how good they are, they're going to lose to the 2 best teams they play every single year. They're having a hard time escaping that. Now, they made the playoffs last year because we've got a 12-team playoff, and they even won a game. So again, I'm not crapping on Penn State, but some of the haters, on some level, the haters are right. Penn State's got to win some of these games some of the time. Oregon can go out here and lose this game, and it's not really going to change the opinion that a lot of people have of Oregon and Dan Lanning, right? However, if Penn State wins that game, it's huge for Penn State. It's huge for their confidence in these types of games. It's big for James Franklin and sort of the way people talk about him and characterize him. It's a home game for Penn State. I think this is going to be an extremely difficult game for Oregon for that reason. However, it is Penn State. They do lose this game every single year. And I don't mean the Oregon game. They haven't been playing Oregon every year. But you know what I mean? Like forever it was Ohio State and Michigan. You just look at the Penn State schedule. You pick out the 2 toughest games on there and you go, well, they're going to lose those 2. And they're going to win the other 10. So This is going to be a very, very interesting game, a pressure-packed game, I think, for James Franklin and Penn State. They get it at home. Big one for Oregon there on September 27th on the road at Penn State. A rematch of last year's Big 12 championship game, by the way, which I think was the best game Penn State played all year. Now, I know Penn State lost that game, but I thought that was the best game Penn State played all year. The reality is Oregon was just a much better team than Penn State last year. I mean, that doesn't mean Penn State was bad. Oregon was just better, in my opinion. But I thought that was the best game Penn State played last year, was that game against Oregon, a loss against Oregon in the Big Ten championship game. So this will be an interesting game, September 27th for Oregon on the road at Penn State. And then that first bye week that we talked about a minute ago, everybody gets 2 bye weeks again. This one comes at a pretty good time. You play 4 or 5 games, couple of road games. You're a month into the season. Okay, let's take a bye week, sort of reassess where are we at, what's working, what's not working. Do we got some injured players, some banged up players that can get some rest and come back afterwards? I kind of like where this falls on the schedule. Falls in between 2 pretty interesting games, too, with the at Penn State and then home against Indiana. Don't really know what to make of Indiana for next season. I have a hard time buying into to teams who sort of have one pop year and don't have like a track record to rely on. And that doesn't mean I think Indiana will be bad. What I mean is they're not Ohio State or Georgia or an Oregon or whoever else that recruits at a top 5, top 10 level year in and year out. Gets who they want out of the transfer portal, 10 plus wins every year for what seems like forever. Those sorts of teams, it's easier to have faith in the future in those teams than it is a team like Indiana. Again, that doesn't mean they'll be bad, but first-year head coach last year, Cignetti there, did lead them to the playoffs, an unbelievable regular season there, come up short against Notre Dame in that playoff game. But because they're so portal heavy, you've just got an insane amount of roster turnover every single year there. Now, if Cignetti goes out and hits a bunch of home runs in the portal and is able to get some guys in there that can run his system and buy in completely in one offseason, then I think Indiana's got a chance to be a good team again, because I do think he's a good coach. It's just hard to be over 50% confident that will happen, because more often than not, it tends not to. But there's still an interesting game here, separated by a bye week on the road at Penn State, home against Indiana. A road game at Rutgers. After that Indiana game, Rutgers a physical team, Greg Schiano. Rutgers, it seems like they beat or come close to beating like one of the big boys every couple of years or so. They never really get over the hump in terms of winning the Big Ten, but they're a respectable team, I guess, under Greg Schiano. We'll see what they are this year. You do have to play them there. Then you come back home and you have a home game against Wisconsin. This could be 2 pretty physical games in a row here, Rutgers and Wisconsin. Well, all the games in the Big Ten are physical. Wisconsin's been a disappointment under Luke Fickell, though. All kinds of success at Cincinnati Fickell had. Unable to reproduce that at Wisconsin. Wisconsin's had 3 of the worst seasons the last 3 years that they've had in the last 25 years. In fact, if you look over the last 28 years, Wisconsin only has 6 seasons where they won 7 games or less. 3 of them all came in the last 3 years. So it has not gone well for Fickell. This feels like sort of a must-win year for Fickell. Not that he needs to win the Big Ten. I don't even think they necessarily need to make the playoffs, but it feels like Fickell needs to get to 8+ wins this season to sort of calm the crowd down there, because it has not gone well for him in Madison. Then you have your second bye week. Again, I think this comes at a pretty good spot on the schedule right before the last month of the season, sort of the stretch run. You get one last opportunity to sort of assess things. How are they going? Okay, how many losses do we have? Where do we fit into the playoff picture? What do we need to do here over the last month of the season to make sure we either get into the Big Ten title game or secure like an at-large playoff type deal? Do we got some players we can get healed up and get back? Comes at a pretty good time. You come out of that bye week on the road at Iowa, good defensive team, struggles offensively. That's generally speaking, that's an Iowa team on any given year. Kirk Ferentz been there for 30 years, it seems like, as head coach. Well-coached team. Going to be a tough place to play on the road. That's not a gimme there. That can be a really tough place to play. Then you come back home and take on Minnesota. Oregon should be a significant favorite there. Back home again the following week against Southern Cal, a familiar opponent from the Pac-12 days. We'll see what Southern Cal is looking like this year. They, like Luke Fickell at Wisconsin, Lincoln Riley has struggled at Southern Cal. He had kind of one good year where they made a New Year's Six game, but then got their brains beat in by Tulane, and it's been kind of downhill since then, honestly, for Lincoln Riley at Southern Cal. Feels like a big year for him out there too. I don't mean a big year in that they're going to win a bunch of games. Maybe they will. I mean, this seems like an important season for him. That they need to win some games, kind of make some noise this year in the Big Ten. We'll see. If they are a good team this year, then this will be a massive game at the end of the year here, Oregon and Southern Cal. And then, of course, the other rivalry game that Oregon has. Do Oregon fans, Washington or Oregon State, what do y'all consider to be a bigger rivalry? I'll tell you, just as a college football idiot that lives down in the Southeast, I consider this game, the Oregon-Washington game, to be a more meaningful game generally every year. Maybe that's because in general Washington has had better seasons than Oregon State. I'm not sure. I understand the Oregon State game's a rivalry completely, for sure. But I don't know. Anyway, how do Oregon fans feel about it? The Washington game and the Oregon State game. How would you rate them as an Oregon fan? And which is more important to you as an Oregon fan that you win, the Washington game or the Oregon State game? But a big game at the end of the year here on the road at Washington. Washington, another team from the Pac-12 that has jumped ship and joined the Big Ten. Had an okay year last year, sort of middle of the road in the Big Ten with a brand new coaching staff. We'll see if they can improve in year two. There you go. That's a look at Oregon's schedule for 2025. What do you think? How can they do in the Big 12 year two? They can't do any better than they did last year, right? 12-0, 13-0 after winning the Big Ten championship game. I mean, you can't. You couldn't have drawn up a better way to come into the conference than that. They literally ran through it. They were the only undefeated team in the country after the regular season and conference championship Saturday last year at 13-0. Ended after that with a 13-1 like we talked about. So we'll see if they can get into the postseason and take it a little bit further this year. But what do y'all think they'll do in the regular season? What do you think about this schedule? Let me know down below. I appreciate you watching. Have a good morning.